name's Andrew Friskop, and my program is really geared at trying to find those management solutions for the diseases that impact small grains and corn in the state. So today, luckily, I get to talk about corn diseases, and how I broke this up is diseases that we often see that we don't need to manage or we don't have management tools for, our most important corn disease in the state. And then finally, I'm going to end on some of the diseases that it kind of popped up this year and one that's knocking on our door. So as promised, some of the corn diseases we see every year. So year in and year out, our most common disease that we will see often as you approach tasseling is common corn rust. As the name implies, rust, this one is pretty easy to identify. You get these rust pustules, often cinnamon brown, that will appear on the leaves. We typically will see this later on in the season, and this pathogen overwinters in the south and is blown up with the southerly wind currents. As far as management, something just to take a look at, but nothing that we need to be all that worried about. So again, just kind of putting these on the radar that you will see some diseases in corn, but some we just don't need to manage at this time. Another one that I think kind of came to a lot more questions this year was corn smut. Kind of reminder of corn smut. These galls that you'll see are very, very distinguishable and very easily to spot in the field. They can protrude from a stem. They can be on an ear, or they can be on the leaf. They tend to be infecting regions that were previously damaged and more or less have the same gall growth. Now, I will get asked questions about seeing common smut or corn smut in a field. Oftentimes, this is localized on a field edge where you see more of the damage, and it, what I call it, kind of runs out as we move throughout a field. In 2021 was a year that we had a fair amount of stock rot concerns. Last year in 2022, not so much. So we were bound to see stock rots, at least in some location in North Dakota each year. And most of the driving factor is stress. As Ryan mentioned, talking about water stress being one of the most important factors, right, for corn production. It can also have an impact later on the season where you see those stems will be cannibalized for nutrients, and then we have weakened stock integrity, and then we see the movements of pathogens in. One of our most common ones, as you can see on the picture, the right-hand side is Fusarium. So when I get asked about stock rots, generally the most common one that we'll see is Fusarium stock rot. Again, when it comes to management, not a whole lot we can do. Harvest decisions is probably the biggest thing. Just try to get to those fields, ones that show the most amount of lodging as quickly as possible. And then finally, I do have to talk about some abiotic causes or ones that are not caused by pathogen. Joe Eichley and I will get brought into conversations about parapet drift. Easy to distinguish just by looking at distribution on a field. If it appeared all of a sudden, it's kind of the same type of questions, the same type of responses we get. And these bleach spots can be seen up and down the canopy, very irregular, something that would indicate some type of drift. The other ones that I get asked questions on is like genetic abnormalities. Once in a while, we might see some ring spots on leaves on one plant randomly in a field. And in this case, we see the anthocyanin production that's really heavy on a corn ear. Here is the purple. Again, you will see what I call weird things in corn once in a while, and oftentimes I'll draw that up to being just genetic abnormalities. So what's corn disease that I'm most worried about in the state as of today? This message probably hasn't changed since 2014, and that's going to be Goss's wilt. The reason why I worry about Goss's wilt is, one, that we can see significant yield loss in a given field. And I have seen this disease anywhere from near Fairmont, North Dakota, all the way up to Williston, North Dakota. So it's a statewide disease. So it's something that we will see and likely see, but we do have some pretty good management options. As far as what does Goss's wilt look like in the States, what I'm going to show you is some of the work that we do each year. It's our corn disease survey. Part of this funding is with the North Dakota Corn Council and the Department of Ag. Here I'm running the year that we've been doing this survey since 2014, and these are the percentage of fields where we found Goss's wilt. You're going to notice that it tends to stay a little bit stable in some years. Certainly in 18 and 20, we saw a higher level of Goss's wilt. Last year, not so much, which I'd say surprised me a little given some of our conditions that we saw with some of the rainstorms. But I guess the big take home message here is that maybe I'm just being more encouraged that we're starting to see more incorporation of hybrid resistance. So that's something that I do have to, I guess I'm hoping that I'm starting to see is there's going to be a little bit more decision making on hybrid resistance. So when you look for it in the field, I kind of bring this up because I often run into pockets. I think pockets, field edges are the easiest ways to kind of start looking for Gauss's wilt. Certainly, we've seen some situations where the entire field has been taken by this disease, but in a usual sense, in a common sense, it's going to be these pockets. Now, leaf burning can be confused with a variety of other factors. But what really separates this one out is look for water soaking. So in this photo, looking between the dark green, light green, and yellow, that's more of the bacterial pathogen moving in the leaf tissue. It causes leaf death since you see the necrosis. And oftentimes, if you get it in the right light at different stages, we have freckles. And this is more where the bacteria is kind of discontinued and left what we call a freckle or a spot in the leaf. When we get to later on in the season, if the disease is progression on susceptible hybrid, this is something that we can typically see. This is taken from a research trial in the last couple of years. So why do I worry about it? What is the yield loss consideration for this disease? So with back in 14 to 17, I had a PhD student. We ran 7 or 8 research trials looking at hybrid or more yield loss in hybrids, and with funding from the Corn Council. To kind of summarize this research, we had very high disease severity in 5 of the 7 locations. And what I am doing is I'm generating the data in terms of yield loss when we would introduce the pathogen. So we had 3 hybrids, they're all DeKalb hybrids at the time, and how these are broken out is just think of them as a susceptible, moderate susceptible, and what would be a resistant hybrid. We would introduce the bacteria either right away in the season at B6 to B10, at R1, the BTR1 stage, or a combination of both. So trying to mimic when the bacteria would probably start colonizing, but also when we start seeing the disease more prevalent, which is around the task line R1 stage. So what did we find? So, I mean, it's not probably alarming to anybody in the audience that the more susceptible the hybrid, the more yield loss. And how I broke this down is that if we're going to assume we're going to use a monosusceptible hybrid, based on this data, I think you can look somewhere between that 20 to 25% yield loss. If you use a susceptible hybrid, it climbs at 35 to 45. So again, this is almost like your degree of risk reduces by half each level that you select off resistance. Also, the other thing that we were taking note of is when we see those late infections, when you see these small pockets that arrive late in the season, we do see some yield loss, but it's not nearly as drastic as if the pathogen had to start on earlier in the season. The other question that has gotten brought up is, can I spray anything? So it's a bacterial disease, so we need to rule out fungicides. We don't have a fungicide that can manage the bacterial disease, but there are some products on the market that is labeled as a bactericide. So going back to some data that some field trials we did in 2020 and 2021, couple locations here. What the treatment list looks like is we had a non-inoculated, so think of it as a healthy check, and an inoculated as a disease check. And the 4 treatments that we picked out were Mastercop, Oxybate, and Fortify. All these do have an element or have some suppression in the label for bacterial disease. And then Veltima was a fungicide. And we weren't looking to see if Veltima would manage this disease, but again, almost going in a fungicide check. We would apply these either at the B10 or B12 stage or at the BTR1 stage. So big picture here, a couple different treatments, a couple different timings, and just to see if we could suppress the disease. So looking at the disease data, here on the bottom axis, you have the treatments. I have it broken out by treatment timings, just so you can focus your attention on that. And this is the disease level. So the higher the value, the more amount of disease. So if we're moving left to right, we have our healthy check, which is a fairly minimal amount of disease. Your disease check, which is a big difference just in the introduction of the disease at a timing. But here I'm more interested in what are these treatments doing. And if I had to summarize what I was seeing in the plots and what was replicated in our data, I'd say that we saw some disease suppression when we were using Mastercop or Fortify. So, and that idea is like we know that we could pick it out, but also we're starting to see that it was actually represented in the data as well. But like anything, what was the yield factor? So same type of setup. The only thing we're looking at here in bushels per acre. Here I'd say it gets a little messy, but I think there are some trends that the lower the disease and then the treatment, the yield values are a little bit higher. Some we're able to separate out, where others kind of been a wash. So if I'm looking at what is the role of a plant protection product or something that's geared at bacteria in corn, we need more data, frankly. We only used one hybrid here, a susceptible hybrid, and it's likely as we start changing hybrids and start changing some of these other elements that our responses are going to be what I probably would call inconsistent. But that's something that we're going to start keep on looking for into last year and into the new year. So some of the key points that I want to bring on Goss's Wilt management: hybrid selection is key. Remember your field history. Just because you didn't have it last year doesn't mean that your neighbor didn't have it or you saw some residue blow on. So just always stay on top of what you're thinking about as far as field history. And kind of moving forward where my research program's going on Goss's Wilt is we're starting to do more trials just to see if there's anything we can spray in season. We also do have some hybrid susceptibility trials out there. Another disease I want to bring up is another bacterial disease, and this is called bacterial leaf streak of corn. And last year I found this, or we found this in more fields than what we were to be expected. So what the general symptoms of with bacterial leaf streak is I'll notice it in the upper canopy. And you'd see these linear lesions, yellowing, the browning, running along the midrib, and doesn't all look that damaging. If you want to think about bacterial disease, it's not nearly as aggressive as we see with Goss's Wilt, but the key thing is that we saw this. So the history on this disease, there was another disease first identified in Nebraska, and we found it in North Dakota back in 2020. We received one field sample from a seed dealer in south central North Dakota. But this year, we found it in 12% of the fields. As far as are we concerned about yield loss with this disease, I would say in every field I found it, I was very minimal. If any, yield loss was very localized. And then yield loss reports out of Nebraska and Colorado are 5 to 15%. And I put a question mark there because I just don't think we'll ever see that much damage from this disease in North Dakota, just because Goss's Wilt is still going to be a much bigger yield limiting disease than what we see from bacterial leaf streak. And then I know there are hybrid differences out there, but we don't have a good feel of what that looks like in the Northern Plains. But I would expect that you're going to see, just like in Goss's Wilt, there are going to be hybrid differences. The last disease I want to touch on is the one that's knocking on our door, and it's the one that I think could potentially change how we look at inputs in corn in North Dakota, and that is tar spot. So tar spot kind of came into the U.S. in Indiana, Illinois about 2013, I believe, and it has been spreading since then. So what I want to show you is what tar spot looks like and where it's at and what it looks like for management. So tar spot, as the name implies, you have these raised black structures. They stay heavily attached to the wheat leaf. They can't be removed even if you add water to them. Sometimes it gets misidentified as insect frass. The key difference is you can remove insect frass with water and agitation, and you won't be able to rub these lesions off. They can cause severe defoliation, and the key thing is just identification at this point. So kind of show you how this disease can spread within a canopy. My counterpart in Purdue, Dr. Talenko, she told the story of they found one tar spot lesion on a leaf and took some really nice photos of it. And then a week later, they came back where they flagged that spot, and you can see that this disease is starting to take off. And that is why it becomes a concern, because it can move quickly once it establishes infection. Once it establishes infection, these lesions stay on the leaves and they're carried on the residue, hence why we can carry this problem into next year, right? So it's a residue-borne disease, it has spores, and it travels. So where is it at in the U.S. right now? So this is a map of the efforts of my colleagues and I that we are looking for tar spot. Every gray shaded county here has tar spot identification. And the reason why I say it's knocking on our door, so if we were just highlight kind of the North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota corner there, it's about 100 to 115 miles away from what's Richland County right now. And it is likely going to get here. I just don't know when or how. Probably going to be something to do with residue management and movement of residue, or it could just be a simple spores just being able to establish infection that we haven't detected yet. And regardless of what it is, we need to start looking for it now, because then we have to start thinking about those management options. So what are the management options? So luckily for us in the northern corn, They have been researching this disease for 8 years, and they're doing a lot of the fungicide efficacy, trying to understand the pathogen. So I think my game plan right now for tar spot is scout. If you find it, send me a photo, send me an email, work with your county agent, be able to get that information to me, and I will help you navigate that, because this is something it's going to be a focus of a research program once it gets here. The conditions for this disease is cool, wet conditions in the literature, which is 60 to 70 degrees and prolonged dews. Last time I checked, if I look in late July to August, average temperatures for the day to 60, 70 degrees, pretty common for most of our state. And we tend to get more of the prolonged dews during that time as well. So that's why I get a little bit worried about it, because our state's conditions might be one area that we have to worry about if it's able to colonize. As far as hybrid differences, we don't know what northern corn is, something that we're going to navigate the waters. But I do say we have good to very good fungicides out there. And the biggest thing is to see if our timing and our resistance is going to hold up with tar spot. So with that, I just kind of want to summarize. Gauss's wilt is our most important disease. Hybrid resistance. You want to make hybrid selection for disease, I encourage you to look at the Gauss's wilt ratings in each of the brochures. We're going to probably see bacterial leaf streak again next year, just something that we're just monitoring at this point. And then finally, with tar spot, start scouting your fields. It's going to get here eventually.